In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to knit a swatch in the round. Swatching in the round is different to swatching flat, and you'll be most familiar with swatching flat. But it's actually quite simple, and it's the easiest way to get an accurate measure of your gauge when you're knitting in the round. Two of our patterns, Mitchin and Pompidou, are knitted in the round, so if you're knitting those patterns, you'll also be swatching in the round. Now the first step is to follow the swatch pattern. All of our patterns come with a swatch pattern for you to follow. As you can see here, I'm casting on the number of stitches that the pattern needs. In this case, it's 34. So once I've counted all of the stitches and I've got them all on the needle, it's then time to press next and get started on the swatch. Following the pattern, I've cast on 34 stitches to start, and when I press next, it now tells me that my swatch needs to be worked in the round. Now this means that we'll be carrying the yarn along the back of the work, but I'll show you step by step. So we start the first row, which is a knit all stitches row. So we leave the stitches where they are and we knit as we would normally, all the way to the end of the row. And when we've completed the row, this is where things become a little bit different. What we're going to do is slide the stitches from the right needle all the way along the circular needle to the left hand needle. So you can see me pushing them along there. So slide along, and then when you get to the other end, we're going to leave the yarn at the back of the work. The next stitch that you're going to knit on the next row is a purl stitch. I lay the yarn on the table or my lap, and then I scoop it up with my needle, and this puts the yarn in the right position for me to begin the row. I make the first purl stitch, leaving a long loop at the back of the work. I then put my needle into the next stitch along, but I don't make the stitch, and I use this to pull the yarn at the back whilst keeping the tension along the rest of the row. I then follow the row instructions all the way along, and for this row it was a purl all stitches. Now it's really important to keep the length of yarn at the back very long, because this allows you to keep that tension correct across the whole swatch. When you get to the end of the row, you can then neaten the edge stitches. So you can do this by gently pulling on those ends of the yarn and pulling up against the stitches that are already there on the edge. So we're now on to the next row, and again I'm going to pull the work all the way from the right needle across to the left needle. And now I'm ready to make my next stitch. Now this stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to leave the yarn at the back of my work. I'm going to put my needle in and then pull the stitch through. And because it's not a purl stitch, I don't need to bring or scoop my yarn through the way that I did before. I can leave it just on the table and then make that stitch. And again, I put my needle into the second stitch along without making the stitch, and just pull the yarn to get that tension correct between the two. So I basically keep them the same length this way without pulling all my other stitches too tightly on the needle. And keeping them the same length is really important, because if they're a bit tighter in areas, this can affect your gauge. It doesn't have to be exact. It's always best to go for looser versus tighter, and you can always undo your swatch and then use the yarn in your project. So don't worry if you feel like you're wasting lots of yarn by doing this method. It's there, it's in your swatch, and it's easy to unpick and add into your project later on. So I'm just going to complete this row, and this is a knit all stitches row. And you'll notice as you're making your swatch that the edges will get a little bit messy, but that's normal when you're swatching in this way, and it's nothing to worry about. As I come to the end of the row, I finish off the last couple of stitches, and then I pull the yarn at the sides to give it a much more neat edge, and it kind of holds it all together. You don't have to do this, but I find that it keeps it much more secure and you don't have any stitches falling off the end. So I move the work from the right hand needle to the left. Again, I just tidy my edge stitches at the end of each row, and this keeps it nice and neat. So the next stitch that I'm going to be knitting is a purl stitch. So again, I lay my yarn on the table and scoop it up, and you see it flicks over my wrist, and that keeps it in the right position to make a purl stitch whilst leaving a long length of yarn at the back of the work. So I then go to make my stitch, and then I place my needle into the next stitch along without making it, and that allows me to pull the yarn again to keep it the same length. And that long length at the back is the key to making sure that this swatch works. Keep repeating this method after every single row sliding the work from the right hand needle across to the left till you've completed your swatch. Once you've finished your swatch, it's time to block. So I've soaked my swatch in some warm water and some wool wash. And the best way I've found to dry my swatches is to create a kind of swatch taco with an old towel, which I then roll the swatch into, as you can see, and then I give it a really firm squeeze, which really gets all of the water out. And once you've done this, you'll have a kind of damp swatch which is ready to pin out. Now, pinning out doesn't need to be complicated, and you'll see, you've got these edge stitches, especially when you've knitted in the round. They're quite loose, and it can be a little bit worrying that your gauge is going to be off. The way that we've designed Made and Worn means that you can just measure in between these kind of loose stitches and only measure the tight stitches. So what I'll do is show you how to pin out your swatch and also give you an idea of where to measure between. So it doesn't matter if those edge stitches get tucked underneath, so if your lines behind are a bit tight, in my swatch they are a little bit tight, and I just start in the top corner and I smooth it down, finding sort of a straight edge, and I begin pinning. And this is all you need to do. You don't need to be stretching it or like moving it out of shape. It's just finding the sort of squareness in the swatch. So I'm just gently kind of moving and smoothing to create this sort of shape. So you can see the nice clean edges there. Not all swatches will be square. So because we're measuring your gauge, your swatch can be rectangular. It might be wider than it is high. If it does come out square, that's great. And when I'm talking about squareness in this video, I'm talking about straight edges. So as long as the side edges and the top are perpendicular to each other, so they're at a right angle, and as long as they are straight, then your swatch is ready to measure. Once I've done the sort of side bits and I've pinned all four corners, I then start looking at like the vertical, so making sure that there's no curves. So you can see there's a curve there. And what I do is I then place a pin to straighten that out. So you can see now as I straighten it, the swatch almost gets shorter, but it pulls itself into a more square shape. So then I put a couple of pins in place to hold it, and these will be left in all the way to when it's dry. And you can use a blocking mat or you can use a towel like I'm using here. And if you have any bits that bow, which you can see, I then like to use the pins to make sure that's a nice straight edge for measuring later on. This method that I'm showing you that leaves a long piece of yarn around the back of the work means you don't have to cut the yarn to get your gauge measurement when knitting in the round. And I hate cutting yarn, it's a waste of material, and so I like to leave a really long length behind and then unravel my swatch later on, either to put into my project or to actually use in a small project like something like our whole bit of mitts. But this is how I like to pin my swatches out and get a measure of gauge. So then you're just measuring all of the stockinette. If you've tucked your edge stitches under, then you're just measuring across the main stockinette body, ignoring the gut stitch borders, and then from there to the top as well.